Nästa gäst kommer från Finland. Tytti Solantaus, som är då forskare vid Institutet för hälsa och välfärd i Finland och som också är en person bakom och rent av initiativtagare till något som heter Nordic Forum, som är ett paraply för de här frågorna i de nordiska länderna. Det kommer vara på engelska och du är varmt välkommen. Du förstår ju svenska om det ska vara någon svensk fråga, men din engelska är bättre än din svenska, kan vi säga. Varmt välkommen.
Down a bit. Okay, thank you very much for inviting me to talk in your seminar. Och jag kan förstå svenska, men min svenska går så långsamt att jag kan inte ge en föreläsning på svenska. Ni ska sova om jag gjorde det. Okay, so I'm going to talk about my experiences and what I have learned across the years. I am a child psychiatrist. I've worked in clinical psychiatry for tens of years, and now I'm working in the Nationell Institutet for Health and Welfare, and which is in charge of developing services in Finland. And I've also done international collaboration, Nordic Forum being one of them. And I am all for Nordic collaboration, and you will find out why. And then there are 2 EU programs that I've been involved in and worked in over 15 countries in Europe. And of course, research is something at the back of all the work that we'd like to do. And we all know that we're dealing with an intergenerational cycle of adversity, which is something that we have to deal with on individual, family, and on societal level. And here are this data comes from Norway, and I think you probably are familiar with it. It shows that about 40% of children, general population children, live in families where parents have diagnosable mental health or substance abuse problems. And in Norway, if there are two children in one family, this means about 20% of families have these problems. And the same figures have come out in Australia and in the Netherlands, so also in Finland, I think. What? This is... Okay, yes, sorry. So we're also interested in families where parents have severe somatic illness. And this data just came out just some time ago. It's a register-based study on 1987 cohort in Finland, about 60,000 children who were followed in the registry by the registrars until the age of 21. And 6 to 7% of these children had a parent with the cancer diagnosis by the age of 21, and 4% by the age of 18. And there was an increased risk for these children for mental health problems, and especially if the parent who was ill also felt depressed and needed psychiatric treatment, or if the other person, if the other parent or spouse also needed psychiatric treatment. So psychiatric treatment increases the risk in these families considerably. Also, prisoners are a population that we need to be aware of and support the children and the families. This is an English study which shows, documents again the very strong intergenerational cycle of adversity in these families. But apart from the parents' own problems, these families also have many other problems, as we all know. And this is something we need to deal with always when we are helping these families. All of these problems in themselves increase risks for children, but when they are all together, or many of them together, the risk is exponentially higher. And this really hit true to me when I worked in the KMH program with these countries. I was the leader of the work package 5, dealing with families with parental mental illness. And this is one of the outcomes of that project, which is that when we touch these problems and these families and children, when we start talking about, take on the table these families, we actually have to, it kind of makes everything move around. We have to look at, we're faced with the human rights, civil rights of these families. What is the level of policy in our country? How about the legislation? How are these families living in terms of basic needs? And so on and so on. Do we have preventive interventions? Do we have the services available? And so on. And so and what's the level of stigma? And how does that play a role? And when my experience in places, in countries, areas where this topic of mental illness, substance abuse parents is taken on the table, the first reaction is always, I think, that how awful those parents are, and we have to save the children from these awful parents. And therefore, the first initiatives or the first thought is to go for the children. The activities are directed towards the children, and the parents are left out and surpassed. And of course, this is what the parents are used to. Parents with mental illness, substance abuse problems, criminality, that they are not listened to in their family's affairs. And so it has happened in me. It has been a process in me. I have had to confront my own stereotypes, my own way of my prejudices and discrimination, which is that do I involve these parents who seem to be not so good and in decision-making about their own families. And one thing which I don't know if you still need to do this in Sweden because the level of awareness is high, but the very common way to raise awareness in mental health hospitals or wherever is to tell about the most awful stories. And I've done it, and I regret it, because it only increases stigma and is not helpful. And the reaction is that, oh, it's so awful, but it's not. That's the reason why it's not our issue. It's for child protection. Some other people do it. And so in order to make people feel that they can do something, and I want to do something, you have to present the opportunities for action. Although it's very tempting to tell the worst stories, because they are really touching. So in this program, I thought, because we had such diversity of countries, that we would be very different. And this is the other finding in this program, that we actually share many of the same things across these very different European countries. Mental illness leads to accumulation of personal, interpersonal, social, and economic problems also in the Nordic countries. And this is my experience concerning Europe, and this is very subjective, which is that there are countries which have very little awareness of the children and no discussion on these children. Very strong stigma linked to both parents and their children, and very harsh attitudes. Then there are countries where there's a rising awareness, but fairly strong stigma also so that the measures are more controlling measures that are directed towards the parents or the families. And in the Nordic countries, I think we have a fairly extensive awareness of the plight of these children, and also proactive attitudes and measures towards the families. That is prevention, acting with the parents, and we are the only ones who have clearly set legislation and policies, proactive legislation. We all have child protection. Well, not all countries in Europe, but most have child protection legislation, which is when something bad has happened, then you move in. The legislation that we have on prevention of problems, I call it proactive. And that's kind of new kind of legislation, legislating prevention. And we have it in the Nordic countries. The Netherlands is here. They don't have the legislation, but they have a long history of prevention in general. Maybe they're the leading country in Europe in mental health prevention overall. And so our action in the Nordic countries is nationwide, while in the other countries it's either missing, very sporadic, or local. But the interest is increasing across Europe. So the more I have worked across different countries, and also I've worked beyond Europe, the more I have started to value our history and the Nordic welfare history, because it has had an impact on our thinking, on our attitudes, and the way we are ready to support those who suffer and are not well off in our societies. And it is exceptional in the world. And that's why I do want to contribute what I can to Nordic collaboration, because individual countries are very small in this world, but joining hands we can maybe make a difference in the whole world. Okay, but going back to the research and things. So we have research on this intergenerational cycle, and Michael Rutter did his thesis in 1966 on children of mentally ill parents. And he already spelled out a call for psychiatric services for adults to respond to the needs of children and the whole family. And this was almost 50 years ago. So now we're there. And there are other studies showing that there's also a risk for physical illness and a risk for a wide range of disorders. The next question is prevention possible? Is it possible to break the intergenerational cycle? Siegenthaler published a meta-analysis early this year. Meta-analysis means that you collect all the research that has been published in the world together to have more power, because each piece of research has their problems and whatever. So in a meta-analysis, you put the research together and you have more power to see whether the interventions have an impact or not. They went through 4,000 different research papers describing interventions, and they selected 13 studies with very high scientific criteria. So in order to get your study into it, you had to have performed the study according to the golden rules of effectiveness study. And there were 9 from the United States, including the Beardsley intervention study, and 1 from Finland. And this I heard about this just before Christmas last year, and it was one of the best Christmas presents that I got, because my study was accepted in this. And what was found out is that prevention is possible, period. So we don't have to wonder about that anymore. And children's risks decrease about 40%. There were over 1,149 kids, I think, in this study. And especially prevention of internalizing disorders, depression. And 17 interventions were needed to prevent one new diagnosis in children. And I think this is actually quite, effective. 17 interventions, because these families have a lot of problems and a lot of risks accumulate. And if 20% of all families are affected, and we, like in Finland, we want every family to have the preventive program. And so it means that we can really make a difference in children's problems. And therefore we need both low threshold interventions or methods and more intensive ones. The low threshold is kind of the first level, the first thing that, at least in Finland, that we want every parent to have, or every family to have. Okay, but in order to know what to do, we have to know how the impact comes about. And this is the result of many studies, including my own, that it is the family process, the family relationships and parenting, which mediate the parental problems impact on children. In our study and in others, there's no direct impact from parental problems to children. And this explains why, if there's nothing else in the family, no other problems, no parenting problems, no problems between the spouses, then the parental mental illness does not impose a higher risk for the children. And so this means that this is the process we have to be interested in when we do prevention. But, okay, I think we are a little behind the time. I think this is something that you know. These families are living in multiple adversities, and so we need to pay attention to that as well. This is an interesting study. Many know Karin van Dorsum because she's one of the seniors in this area and also known in our countries. She carried out a beautiful study on depressed mothers and their babies, and she got very good results on her intervention. However, there's no effect on the family or on the mother-baby relationship if there were other problems in the family as well, and not only the maternal depression. And for me, this means that interaction between people, it doesn't happen in a vacuum, but the mother also has to have enough resources, and so we have to take care of that aspect as well. So what do children and adolescents need? Warm and supportive relationships at home. This is probably the most important thing. And then also involvement, integration and sense of belonging to school and daycare, preschool. And then leisure time activities which are constructive with good friends and so on. The free-floating afternoons, there are many studies, especially by Dorlak, showing that if kids are left on their own in the afternoons after schools, there's a risk for tobacco, alcohol, that kind of problems. And of course, especially in families where parents don't have the strength to do the monitoring that much. Okay, and in addition to those, understanding what is happening and why, and agency. Being able to act, to do something. Participation in problem solving according to the level of development. An experience that I can do something. And this is also for adults. And so what is needed? And what we can help, what can we do to help parents to understand their children's experiences, what the children are going through. And for children to be able to make sense of what I have heard, what I have seen, what I've been wondering. So make sense of their experiences. And then joint problem solving. How do we go about it when the mother is in bed all the time, and how to do? Coping with stress is an American intervention, and also it's been taken up in Finland. And it is a group intervention for adolescents. Adolescents who have symptoms of depression, but not depression yet. And also it can be used in situations where the parent has had depression or is presently depressed. And it is a cognitive behavioral intervention, and also including coping with the problems at home. And the results were very good. There were fewer symptoms in the intervention group, fewer diagnoses, persisting up to 2 years after the intervention. But the very interesting thing is that there was no impact if the parent was presently depressed. And what I make out of this is that we have to deal with also with the parents, with the family environment where the youngster lives in. And this comes back to the definition of resilience. Resilience means okay development, even if there are risk factors around. And resilience is not a characteristic of an individual. That's kind of past thinking. Right now, in the scientific literature, it has been shown that it is something that develops in interaction with the environment. Which means then that we cannot install resilience in a child and think that that's then enough. But resilience is developed and sustained in interaction with the environment. So we have to, in these cases, we have to deal also with the family, with the parents and the family environment, so that the parents can support their children's resilience. The BSc program is built on these issues, and he carried out a study, a randomized study on comparing it to a lecture with lecture information in 105 families. And both interventions were beneficial for the families, but the family intervention group improved in family communication, which is one of the targets of the intervention, to have joint discussions and sharing about the family problems. And we have the Let's Talk About Children, which is a discussion with parents about children, designed for services for adults, so that the therapist or the psychologist, social worker, nurse talks with the parent about children and gives information, and they discuss an action plan, how the parent can support the children, including how to tell about my problems and help the children cope with it all. And we compared the Let's Talk and the Family Talk intervention in 119 families and followed them up for 1.5 years. And there was a decrease in children's depressive and anxiety symptoms in both interventions. And this was not because the parents got better. So it was independent of parents' state. The family talk was more effective in depressive symptoms, while the little intervention was more effective in changing attributions, which was a total surprise for us. But I will go in more detail in this in the workshop that follows. But there are also, there are also some other indications that in some issues, smaller is more. And also what we think is that there are for instance, in substance abuse families, the family intervention seems to work wonderfully because the parents need more work on mastering their own problems. There are support groups in Finland developed, and they are also quite a lot. There's training also in Sweden, and these support groups draw on both peer support theory and the family process, so that they build up peer support and at the same time a family process which is needed. I think we're a little, so I'll go on. Compass studied a family group program. Now again, this was a family group, a group of families, adolescents and their parents together, so joining the peer support and the family. And the parents had a current history of depression or current depression. And so they educated in the families about the children and the parents about depression, coping skills for both of them, and parenting skills for parents. And the results were very good. And this time, also in families where parents were depressed at present. So what I take out of this is that we really need to work with the family environment as well. Okay, just we're coming to the end. I'm going to tell you more about this effective child and family program in Finland. It has two trajectories. One is the adult services, how to change them. And then the second one is how to build community-based services, including daycare and school, to cover the needs of these families. And then the Nordic collaboration. We started it the first meeting was in 2005, and it was based on the idea that putting our forces together we could move more rapidly because we have similarities and especially a culture of social responsibility in our countries. And I think we have seen a rapid increase in level awareness, knowledge base, development of methods, and also the legislation that has come up. And here are some things that the different countries, we had a meeting yesterday, and Denmark wanted to tell you that they have had a national network of professionals working for these families since 2004. National guidelines for psychiatry to take care of the kids, 2007, and the same in somatic health services this year. And they have a lot of wonderful material. They are specialists in making wonderful materials for children, families, and professionals. We have the national program, research, and guidebooks, which have also been used in Sweden. Norway excels in multidisciplinary approach and methods in community-based services and has developed peer support programs. And also legislated, had the proactive legislation in 2011. And Sweden, you started already with the Milton money in 2005, I think. Hannele can correct me if I'm wrong. And so extensive training in this method started and raising awareness, and which I think can also be seen in the startup of the Kompetenscentrum on this, and proactive legislation. We are building up a website And we have annual conferences since 2005. The first one was in Finland. And now, this coming spring, it's going to be in Sweden. And it's here in May, 22nd to 24th. And it's going to be a big thing, so welcome. Thank you.